Hello and welcome to Panglot World Languages, where we speak about languages around the world. Today, we will be speaking about the Newar language, also known as Nepal Bhasa, with Dr. Alexander James O'Neill. Alexander James O'Neill is a specially appointed assistant professor at the Department of Liberal Arts at Musashino University in Tokyo. He was previously a research fellow at the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto's Department for the Study of Religion. He has a broad range of interests, including Sanskrit, Buddhist texts, and manuscripts from South Asia, especially Nepal. He has a passion for Newar Buddhism and the Newar language that we'll be speaking about today, the Newar language and culture. In addition, he is interested broadly in Mahayana Buddhism, ranging from Sanskrit and Newar literature to Chinese and Japanese Buddhist texts and practices. So, with that introduction, welcome, Dr. Alexander.
Hello, thank you very much.
Would you mind giving a short introduction of yourself using the Newar language, and then afterwards we'll continue in English?
Certainly, yeah. Jojo Lapa, Jiguna Alexander Ka, di Musashino Vishwavidyalaya e Ja Yanachona, Jigu Anusandan Buddha Dharma wa Newar Sanskriti wa Bhasha Ka. And so there I'm just saying Jojo Lapa means hello. Some people also say namaste, namaskar, which is the same in Nepali and Nepal Bhasa. And my name's Alexander O'Neill. I work at Musashino University, and my research is on Buddha Dharma, Buddhism, and Newar culture and language.
About your relation with Newar, let's speak first about your experience with Newar, and then we'll get a bit more into Newar itself as a language and a society. So could you speak a little bit about your experiences with Newar first?
Yeah, certainly. So my background, as you mentioned, is primarily in studying Buddhism, and as my interest in Mahayana Buddhism grew, I came to become acquainted with Newar Buddhism, which is the kind of Buddhism that is practiced in the Kathmandu Valley by the Newar community. And this is the only living example of a Buddhist tradition that still uses Sanskrit manuscripts and also Sanskrit texts, particularly for ritual purposes. And so that's the thing that really got me hooked. I thought that's very unique. But in order to properly study Newar Buddhism, one can't just learn Sanskrit because people don't engage in conversational Sanskrit. I have actually met one or two who do.
Really?
Yes, yeah. There is a modern movement towards spoken Sanskrit, although the way that people, the way that people speak Sanskrit these days is a bit different than what you would find in classical texts. So usually in Sanskrit texts, they exclude the copula asti, but this is usually included in spoken Sanskrit these days because that kind of imitates English and Hindi and Nepali. But yeah, I really had to study the Newar language. And so I started with my doctoral supervisor, Christoph Emmerich at the University of Toronto, who's really fluent in the Newar language and many, many other languages, Tamil and Burmese. Someone who maybe I can put you in touch with as well. And yeah, we started reading classical Newar. And so classical Newar is referring to the literary tradition of the Newar language, which maybe we can talk a little bit about it in a bit. But yeah, we focused on that. And the first text that I read together with my supervisor was this one, the Manichu Avadana Trita. So the kind of extract of the Avadana, the past life story of Manichuda, who was a legendary figure who was born with a jewel in his head. And there were some, tricky Brahmins who wanted to extract this jewel from his head to get all of the power from this jewel. And this is the story of his life.
Tricky Brahmins.
So it's a Buddhist story. So it has a kind of a biased approach to Brahmins, but it's
Right.
it's a really great read, and that's what we began with. And I also began with my supervisor spoken contemporary Newar or Nepal Bhasa, and then eventually I studied Nepal Bhasa in Nepal with a teacher called Lakshminath Shrestha, and also another teacher called Vishnu Chitrakar, and several other teachers along the way. So yeah, I've studied both contemporary and classical Newar, but I don't consider myself by any means uh, an expert in it. But I'm
Mm.
glad that that you have asked me to answer some questions about it. I think I'll be able to do so today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I should clarify for the audience that when I contacted Alexander, if I may, when I
Yeah,
contacted Alexander, we had actually met previously at a conference, but it had been something like 4 or 5 years or so since we spoke. And since then, Alexander's moved university and slightly moved in research focus away from Newar directly, as I understand.
yeah. Well, actually, I still do work on Newar, and I guess I should. Well, earlier last year, I published a translation of a contemporary Newar commentary on a Buddhist
Right.
text.
So you do. So
And
I don't remember what
yeah,
I'm not
well, I
entirely
do.
clear why there was
But
some
what I
reticence then.
but what I have moved away from is, I mean, I'm not working on a linguistics project at the moment.
I see.
And at the
Right.
time we met, I was actively involved in a historical linguistics project.
Right. Whereas now it's more of a study of religion.
Yeah, cultural and more of a cultural and religious study. Yeah,
So in your introduction here about your relationship with Newa, several languages came up actually, not just one. In fact, I want to
yeah,
first mention the you mentioned the copula. I think not everybody listening to this is actually a linguist. So just to explain that the copula is basically the word is, and to say that in some languages you don't have to say is, you can just say like car black to mean the car is black, whereas in other
yeah,
languages like English you do have to use it. And I think what you were making reference to is that in Sanskrit normally you wouldn't need to use the word is, but now it is used frequently because that's an imitation of English, as I understand.
yeah, and Hindi and Nepali.
And Hindi and Nepali, yeah,
Yeah,
not just English.
yeah,
Yeah. So, but then also you mentioned Sanskrit. I'm quite I didn't even realize that at all, that they read. It's a bit like if people were studying the Bible exclusively in Koine Greek or something. Like you
yeah,
never read, there's no St. James version, there's no English version. It's like, no, we're going straight to the Greek kind of thing, and people talking to each other in Koine Greek, just
yeah.
in conversation. That would be pretty special if people were doing that. So that's quite interesting. But also, you mentioned classical Newar. So Newar is a very interesting case. I mean, I find every language that I speak about on this podcast interesting, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it. But Newar is an interesting case for the fact that it has this very long history and this extremely literate history. As you mentioned, classical Newar. I don't know exactly. You can probably inform me better about the period, but we're at least talking many centuries ago.
Yeah.
And this very literate history, and nowadays is an endangered language despite being such an important language historically, including with this vast body of literature. So it's, a very interesting case from that perspective. So could you also give us a little bit of an introduction to Newar itself? So,
Sure.
you know, we now have some overview of your contact with Newar, but then in terms of, where are the speakers? How many roughly do we have? Historically, what was the situation? Could you share a little bit about that?
Definitely. Well, Newar is a Tibeto-Burman language, and that means that it's part of a language family. It's the same language family as Tibetan and Burmese, contemporary Tibetan and Burmese.
So I might
And
add, sorry to interrupt, but I might add that what's significant about this is that it makes it not related to languages like Hindi or many of the languages
yeah,
of India. There are Tibeto-Burman languages in India, but it's in a minority in terms of being in this family rather than the Indo-Aryan family, which is more typical for most languages of India. Sorry to interrupt, just a clarification.
oh
But please
yeah,
continue.
yeah. No, that's exactly right. And in contemporary Nepal, many people might be familiar with the language Nepali, which refers to the national language of Nepal, and that is an Indo-Aryan language or Indo-European language, whereas Newar is a Tibeto-Burman language, and it developed in the Kathmandu Valley. And the term Newar comes from the Sanskrit term for the Nepal Valley, which is now referred to as the Kathmandu Valley. And due to vowel and consonant shifts, the pronunciation of the Sanskrit Nepala shifted to Newara, which in modern Newar is pronounced Newa. Newa. And the Newar language has this tendency to shorten loanwords. But at its core, the Newar language is essentially monosyllabic. So it has building blocks made up of single syllables, which, when put together, creates different syntactic functions within sentences. And so one of the great things that you can do with this from the Newar perspective is you can borrow words from any language, from English, but especially from Sanskrit historically, and also Maithili, and more recently Nepali, and put those words within Newar sentences with Newar verbs at the end, and you can make Newar sentences out of Sanskrit words. And so we end up with a situation in classical Newar where there are many texts which are, in terms of vocabulary, about 80% Sanskritic, or just Sanskrit, or Maithili, loanwords from Indo-European, South Asian languages, with 20% Newar, primarily with regard to verbs and pronouns and so forth.
So it's as if Newar is providing a lot of the grammar, but then the vocabulary is coming from Sanskrit, actually.
A lot of it is. But then in terms of spoken Newar, well, we don't know for sure how it was historically, but in contemporary Newar, in contemporary spoken colloquial Newar, you can easily speak sentences without using Sanskrit vocabulary, but there are many words for which there are only Indo-European words. Many of those words have been assimilated into Newar. I mean, one example is, of course, the name of the language, Newar, Nepala.
Yeah, I wanted to say, so you mentioned another language here, Maithili. That's not a language I've heard of before. Is this another language of Nepal, Maithili?
This is a language of a region directly south of the Kathmandu Valley in India, contemporary India. And many of the kings of Nepal had relatives from that region. And so the Maithili language had a very large impact on courtly life in Nepal. And so there was a situation, a bit similar to English, where the courtly language was French for several centuries, and the colloquial everyday language of the populace was English, Middle English at the time. And it was a similar situation in Nepal, where the courtly language was Maithili, and the language of the populace was Newar.
So this is unusual because there are some ways in which this is analogous to other cases that I know about. So, for example, Persian has a lot of Arabic loanwords. It is possible to speak Persian limiting the number of Arabic loanwords. Famously, Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the sort of a major literary work, is deliberately removes all Arabic words out of principle. But it's also possible to make. I actually did this when I was learning Persian. I made entire stories only using Arabic words. Partly the reason for that is because they're actually harder to learn, and I always confused all my Arabic loanwords. So I would make like entire little short stories, every single word of which was Arabic, but the actual was in Persian. So, I've heard, for example, there's that example in English. there was a Greek politician or a Greek diplomat who made an entire short story, like an essay almost, in English, where every single word other than and the and so on was in Greek. They were all Greek loanwords. So, you can do this in some other languages just because of the great influence of Greek on English. I mean, Latin even more so, French even more so. So I can see, and often these are, in a sense, the more kind of high culture words. The kinds of, I remember the story I wrote in Persian was something about an official who had embezzled the dowry of, it was just like some really weird words, and a lot of them were very technical, like embezzlement. So yeah, you would often see this, and I can see how if you had a literary text that you might use a lot of very technical Buddhist terminology and so on. But what's unusual is that you also say that the courtly language is this other language, Maithili, because, well, I suppose because the written language here is Newar, it seems, just with lots of loanwords, but Newar. Whereas in England, we didn't have a situation where English was, as I understand it, English wasn't the primary language. I might get this wrong, actually, but my understanding is that English wasn't the primary language things were written in for quite a while, and it was Latin for many centuries, and French was the court language. So English was basically the language of the ordinary people. But here you're describing a case where the literary language and the court language are not the same, because the literary language is Newar and the court language is Maithili. Or am I misunderstanding something?
It's actually quite similar in the sense that the primary literary language was Sanskrit. Yeah, so that was the primary language for religious texts and literature that was copied in manuscript culture. And there were also Sanskrit, Buddhist, and Hindu texts that continued to be written in Nepal, even into the 16th century. So,
right.
Yeah, so it's always been a kind of mixing pot of various languages, although the majority of people within the Kathmandu Valley, what's referred to today as the Kathmandu Valley, would have spoken Newar. There's also the influence of Tibetan. And the trade between Nepal and Tibet was very, 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 very strong for quite some time. And it was commonly the case that Newar merchants would go to Lhasa in Tibet, set up a shop there for trade, have a second family in Tibet with a Tibetan wife, and then have another family in Nepal. And so this is a common theme in
Did everyone know
some
about
literature.
that, or was that clandestine? Was that a commonly accepted thing, or were they doing it in secret?
It's a good question. It seems to be accepted. Okay. There is a lot of literature about merchants who go to other countries and fall in love with people in those other countries, and one of the famous examples is the story of Singha Sorta Bahu, and there is a translation that was published several years ago by Kamal Ratna Tuladar. And so in this story, there's a merchant who goes to sea and goes to an island with lots of treasure, and there are ladies there who are very, very enticing and very, very seductive. And all of the merchants fall in love with these ladies. They end up getting married to them. But then it turns out that they're actually all rakshasis. They're all demonesses, and they transform and are about to eat all of the merchants.
I hate it when that happens.
Yeah.
It's really awkward weddings, those.
So yeah, maybe this expresses a little bit of a, or you could say it's kind of social criticism of this practice. But it's a very old story, actually. But
that makes sense.
It seems to be very popular in Nepal, and possibly for that reason. Whereas, for Maithili, because many of the Mallas, the kings of Nepal, they would have also spoken both Maithili and Newar. There are also many Malla kings who have written very, very popular and very, very lovely Newar poetry. and songs.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not an absolute division, but definitely, yeah. There is an interesting situation with all of these different languages, and then of course in the 18th century we have Nepali coming into the picture, and so Nepali was introduced to the Kathmandu Valley by the Gorkhas. I think English speakers might be familiar with the term Gurkha because there's a Gurkha regiment in the British Army and several other armies around the world. Now, the Gurkha regiment is a term, or Gurkha for the regiment is a term used for essentially soldiers who are selected for that regiment from Nepal, but they're not necessarily from Gorkha. And so this, but the name originally
Right.
comes from Gorkha. It's related to this term for Gorkha. And so Gorkha was a hill fort, and the speakers or the inhabitants of Gorkha, well, they spoke an Indo-European language, which at the time was called Gurkhali, which is actually quite similar to Maithili in many ways. But it's also similar to Hindi, and also similar, it also has a lot of, it has some Persian features as well.
Oh, okay.
And so the Gorkhas took over the Kathmandu Valley in the late 18th century and essentially imposed the Gurkhali language on the Kathmandu Valley as the national language, in turn suppressing the Newar language. And eventually in the 20th century, as a kind of attempt to create this national unity, the Gurkhali language was renamed to Nepali. And so what used to be called the Nepal language or Nepal Bhasa literally means the Nepal language, which is Newar, was then kind of sidelined, and the national language of Nepal became known as Nepali, which was originally this language from Gorkha.
Wow.
Originally, the Kathmandu Valley was referred to as Nepal, so it's an interesting kind of obscuration of that history for political reasons. But for better or worse, that's the name of the language now. That the national language is Nepali, which is an Indo-European language.
So you also mentioned the Nepal used to refer to just the Kathmandu Valley, and I understand by that you mean that the current borders of the nation state of Nepal are wider than that. And do they include the Gorkha kind of homeland?
Yeah.
Okay. So historically these would not have. So historically these were usually. Well, I mean that's probably true of a lot of countries to be honest. But like just for clarity, historically these are sort of separate states most of the time, and they've just been kind of lumped together at some point. Is this something to do? Is it the British again, like with their sort of withdrawing the empire and then making up countries? Was that basically what happened?
It is part of the story. Well, the Gorkhas were trying to unify a lot of these valleys in what is modern-day Nepal. It's essentially made up of a series of valleys from the Terai, which is the plain, which is on the border of India and modern Nepal, and the Himalayas in the north. And so connecting those are many valleys, and one of those, the largest and usually the most prosperous of them, was the Kathmandu Valley. Modern-day Kathmandu Valley used to be called the Nepal Valley. And so it used to be that when people were going to the Kathmandu Valley, they would say, "I'm going to Nepal.
Right.
Nepale Wane. I'm going to Nepal." But the Gorkhas, they unified a lot of these fairly, you could say, militarily weak and politically weak valleys, and they made the Kathmandu Valley the most prosperous of these, their capital. And the borders were really drawn on an international, I suppose, in terms of international diplomacy after the Anglo Nepal War. The official name for it is escaping me.
What roughly time are we talking about that formed?
Must be the early beginning of the 19th century, or end of the 18th century.
And Newar now is an endangered language. It's classed as endangered.
Yes. Yes.
So, as you say, it's been kind of pushed out to some extent, or dominated in some way by Gurkhali, which became renamed. Excellent branding exercise, renamed itself to Nepali. So, can you speak a little bit to that current situation of the language endangerment, or people interested in revitalization? Also, do you have any sense of roughly of numbers, like how many people are involved? How many people are consider themselves Newar or are speakers of Newar?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of the language endangerment and the suppression of the Newar language, yeah, this began not necessarily with the conquest by the Gorkhas, by the Singh dynasty, but it really began in earnest when their prime ministers took over, and they called the Ranas, and they ran as a kind of military leaders, and they maintained a rather iron grip over the populace and enforced Nepali as the national language. And eventually they made printing in the Newar language illegal, and also teaching Newar in schools. And so people could
Is this the
only.
19th century? Is this something that happened in the 19th century?
It started in the 19th century. The ban on printing, I believe, was primarily in the early 20th century.
Hmm.
And in the early 20th century as well, there were many attempts at revitalizing and pushing back against this ban. And so there are many, and some of them still exist today, but there were many hidden libraries and hidden bookstores where illegally Newar books were being printed and sold. And many of the most famous poets of the Newar language and most famous writers of the Newar language wrote at this time of oppression. I'll
Oh,
just give the name of one of them, whose work I also worked on recently. Last year, I mentioned I published a translation of his first printed work, which was a commentary on a Buddhist text called the Ekavingshati Pragya Paramita Stotra, which means the perfection of wisdom in 21 verses. But this person who published that translation, that commentary, is most well known for his translation or adaptation into Newar of the Lalita Vistara Sutra, which is the life of the Buddha. And this is
mm.
a contemporary reprint of it.
It's a very thick book.
And his name is Nishtananda Vajracharya. And so
Mm.
he's considered the Gadya Guru, or the prose guru, the guru of prose, of natural spoken Newar as people actually spoke it. Because until then, Newar was mostly written in the literary form, the classical form.
Mm.
And so he was actually quite lucky. He didn't end up getting imprisoned, but many of the greatest poets and authors of the period were imprisoned and also wrote poems and important essays from prison. Perhaps the most famous poet in the contemporary Newar language is Chittadar Hridaya, and he wrote many of his most famous poems from prison. And then in terms of what happened after that, well, the Rana regime fell in the middle of the 20th century and was replaced by what was called the Panchayat government. It was, I won't get into the details of the politics, but essentially the monarchy had a stronger role. But this monarchy, the Shah monarchy, they were the descendants of the Gorkhas,
Mm.
who speak the Nepali language. But gradually restrictions were lifted, and eventually people were able to print again, and it's still a very, very literate culture. It should be emphasized that the Newar language during the period of classical Newar, which is up until the beginning of the 20th century, essentially up until 1911, which is when the first contemporary printed Newar text was published, that whole period of classical Newar is extremely literate. And the amount of literature that was printed that is sitting in archives, sitting in people's attics, sitting in temple libraries, which nobody is studying, nobody is reading. It's a massive corpus of materials that that needs to be preserved. Okay, then going to more recent times, what's the situation today? Well, the population of ethnically Newar people, Newars, in in Nepal, in the whole country, is about 1.3 million, and the proportion of those who do speak the Newar language natively as their mother language is probably about half. And so it's quite a difficult situation. It's not as bad as some languages, but it is definitely an endangered language, and it definitely needs protection. In terms of the Kathmandu Valley itself, of course, it used to be 100%, well, yeah, maybe 98% Newar speaking people from Mithila who spoke Maithili. They were the court, and the rest would have spoken Newar, and eventually, or occasionally, Tibetan traders would come in. But essentially, it would have been about 98% Newar speakers. And then in the middle of the 20th century, I believe the census from 1952 said maybe about 70% of the valley spoke the Newar language. And then in the 90s, early 90s, that figure was at, I believe it was at about 30%. And now it's probably about 10 to 20% of the valley can speak Newar. But
right, so this is separate from because you also mentioned the sort of Newar ethnic people. It's about 50%, but a lot of people in the Kathmandu Valley are not Newar ethnic people.
Yeah, in the Kathmandu Valley, those who are ethnic Newar might be maybe about 30%, but don't quote me on that.
Okay.
I'm not, I'd have to double check. Yeah. But I think it's probably about 30%, 20 to 30%.
Yeah. So if you're in Kathmandu, do you encounter Newar? Like, is that something that you'll see? Do you see street signs, or do you hear people speaking it? Do you see it?
You don't see street signs in many places, but you do hear it. It depends on where you are. So there are some districts where there are many Newar shops and Newar speakers, and you'll hear Newar speak the language to one another. If you go into a Newar Buddhist temple, you will hear Newar spoken almost exclusively. Yeah, and of course in houses, people will speak among their family. But for the most part, if you don't know what ethnicity someone is, you'll speak to them in Nepali.
Right. I mean, one thing that's interesting is that the timing, the 1911 you gave, this is also, there was a very similar thing going on in Chinese literature where they were moving away from Wenyan, or they were starting to consider moving away from Wenyan, which is the sort of literary standard, a very formal Mandarin that nobody would actually speak, and writing in Baihua, which is basically like the spoken language but put down as writing, which is what you would do in English. There's no equivalent in English of this, where there's like a separate version of English which is only used for writing. I suppose the closest you could possibly get is something like legalese, but that's not even the perfect analogy. So yeah, you have something similar like that happening actually at the same time. I don't imagine they influenced each other very much because I don't think they're closely connected, but it's interesting that the timing is so close with those transitions. But one thing I want to ask about, and I'm quite interested in, is the extent to which Newar people are aware of and proud of their history and heritage. I mean, this example of them in the early 20th century having an underground literary movement of writing and reading and keeping books, selling books, and so on, that clearly shows that they were, they were going against the grain, or they were going against the government at least, to support their language and their heritage. And on the other hand, you've just spoken about how it's only about 50% of Newar people are native speakers of Newar. So that kind of drop in usage, or that drop in proficiency, is in many language communities, that's partly got to do with a lack of prestige. It's often something like the people of this community largely or often don't think this language is important. They think that they should speak some other language, maybe the national language more, because this language, they consider it to be, oh, this is a whatever. They have things they might say about it. They say, this is a peasant's language. This is a language that won't get you ahead. In order to get ahead, you have to speak this other language. I'm going to speak, in this, I suppose, in the case of Nepal, I don't know if this is true, but the thing I'm surmising that it might be some parents say things like, I'm only going to speak Nepali to my kids because if they speak Nepal Bhasa, they're not going to study that at university. They're not going to use this language in business or in university. So why should I teach them this language? I should speak to them in Nepali. Whereas a different view, which some people might have in the population, would be like, well, this is my language, I'm going to speak it to my kids. And another one would be, we actually need to protect our culture because we think our culture is important. And just because the government doesn't like it, or just because you can't earn money from it, doesn't mean we shouldn't maintain our culture and our heritage. So it seems from your descriptions that people of sort of Newar descent, at least historically, seem to be very aware of their history and heritage. But is that something that is still true now, or was there a period that was weaker? Could you speak a little bit about that prestige angle?
Yeah, definitely. And the way that you described it is exactly the situation in Nepal. In terms of the prestige coming back, it definitely has revived a bit since, at least that's my impression. I haven't been going since since the Rana era, but just based on what I hear, it has been revived a bit. And now there are lots of schools in the Kathmandu Valley where people can study the traditional scripts of the Newar language and study the Newar language with a teacher. I attended one of these schools. Teacher's name is Ruben Shakya, and he has been kind of spearheading attempts to get the children in his neighborhood speaking Nepal Bhasa, speaking Newar again. But for many people, there is an attitude of complacency about their language, about Newar. And exactly, there, in terms of economic opportunities, it's pretty much all Nepali and English. So, yeah, we see a decline in speaking Newar at home, and that also changes the way the language is spoken, depending on the generation. Different grammatical forms and features may be forgotten or misused, but of course, those misuses may eventually become the new norm and may become correct over time. So one example is classifiers. So like Chinese, when you're counting things in Newar, you have to add a classifier to specify what kind of thing it is. So for example, if you're counting a living being, like a human or an animal, you have to have the classifier ma, which is related to the Tibetan mi, which means body. And so if you say there's one person or two people, you would say cha ma, there's one person, or ni ma, two people. But if there's two houses, you would use a different classifier. But there have been, for example, last time I was there, I heard children referring to two houses as ni ma ching, which means two living being houses. So it's as if the houses were living.
Sort of the wrong classifier. So this, I mean, I think this might warrant a little bit more explanation. I can provide some Chinese examples. So classifiers are a thing that doesn't exist in any European language. So people only familiar with European languages will not know what this is. And this is more frequent in languages that don't distinguish between the singular and the plural. So in languages like Mandarin, for example, there's no singular and plural, but you do have to use this, which I normally call a measure word, but it's another word for it is classifier. So it's just very, very foreign to people who speak a European language. But instead of saying like two chairs, I can't say two chairs. I have to put a word in the middle that it's almost like when you're speaking about water, you would say two bottles of water or two glasses of water. I think in English nowadays, you actually can say two waters and people understand what you mean. It would be something like 2 glasses of water from the bar or something. But in at least much of the time, you would require that people say 2 glasses of water to bottles of water. And so it's like that thing with bottles of water, glasses of water, but for everything. It doesn't just have to be for water. So it wouldn't just be 2 chairs. That's not grammatical. You'd have to say, so in Mandarin, you'd use either ba or zhang for a chair. So ba is for objects that you can hold with one hand. So it's like, because the chairs are called a grabbable, it's like a grabbable object. So it's like 2 grabbable object chairs is how you would say 2 chairs. Or like another way you'd use zhang, and zhang means flat objects. And that's referring to the seat of the chair. So you could say, you could either say 2把椅子, or you could say 2张椅子. So the ba meaning you can grab them, and the zhang meaning they are flat. So zhang, for example, would be used whenever you're numbering like how many beds or tables or pieces of paper or sometimes chairs there are. Ba would be used for things like tools and like guns, like but also chairs. And then you have other ones. Sometimes they get very narrow. Like you get one specifically for ships, which is soul. So like if you're counting how many ships there are, you have to use this like a ship specific measure word. So I actually really love measure words. I think they're really cool. They were one of my favorite things about learning Mandarin, actually, because I love how you can sometimes have the flexibility to intimate something about an object just by changing this word without explicitly saying anything in particular. So if you describe something as itun, then it means it's like a pile. Then you're describing it as fat. Whereas if it's like itiao, then it's like a long or wavy string, or like a long and wavy line. So like if somehow, I mean, this is a little bit stretching the grammar of the language, but if you described a person as itunren or itiaoren, I mean, you wouldn't normally say that, but if you were going to do that, it's like you're describing them either as very long and thin, very tall and lanky, or very sort of short and fat. But it's not normal grammar in a way. You have, to some extent, some power to do this with the grammar of sort of intimating what, just because the measure words or classifiers are different. So you also have something like what you're describing in Mandarin, although it's not context-induced change. So it's not because of people becoming less fluent in the language, but you have this kind of widely used measure word ge, and ge is used for all kinds of stuff that doesn't have any particular classifier. It's used for people informally. There's also more formal ones for people, but informally it's used for people, but then it's often used just for lots of stuff. So people kind of start using it everywhere. So I guess that's what's happening here with ma, if I pronounce that correctly. That, you know, normally that specifically refers to living things. If you say ma, house, you're sort of suggesting that the house is somehow a person, which doesn't make any sense. But they're doing this because it's just like an increasingly widely used measure word. Have I got the understanding right there?
Yeah, exactly.
Measure words are quite hard to explain because they're completely foreign. Like there's just nothing like it. I mean, the closest thing you have something like it is, I say, like a bottle of water or a box of shoes or something. Like that's the closest you can get. But like this is for individual items of any kind that you need that in languages like Mandarin.
Yeah.
And Newar. So one thing I wanted to ask about is, or get into a bit, is talking about writing, because Newar is, as you've mentioned already, very literary, but it also has its own writing system specific to Newar, so an alphabet. So there's lots to unpack here. One thing at a time maybe, but there's sorts of things I'd like to ask about. I'd like to ask about calligraphy. I'd like to ask about the alphabet and where it comes from. I'd like to ask about printing. I'd like to ask about literacy. Maybe let's start from a little bit about the alphabet. Or the writing system, could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So we'd refer to it as a syllabary because it doesn't start alpha, beta. It doesn't start with A, B. It's usually ordered in the same way as Sanskrit. So it begins with ka, ka, ga, ga, nga. These are the first 5 syllables. And or actually it starts with the vowels, I should say. Yeah, even before the consonants. So it starts with and so forth. So the vowels of Sanskrit. So essentially, the writing system was an adaptation, or it's the same writing system that would have been used for Sanskrit. And so the
Oh,
original
but is it the same? I thought it looked a bit different.
Yeah,
Is it
it's
actually the
actually
same?
yeah, it's actually the same that was used for Sanskrit, and it's not actually perfect for Newar because many Newar sounds don't correspond to the same, or you could say aksharas. Akshara is the Sanskrit word for these letters in the syllabary.
Yeah, when I was looking up a little bit about Newar, then I noticed that it's very rich in vowels. This language has a
Yeah,
large number of vowels, which is a bit reminiscent of English. And English, as I'm sure listeners of the podcast are aware, has awful spelling
yeah,
because partly because there are so well, I mean, for a whole range of reasons that I'm not going to unpack, but partly because there are so many vowels and we've only got 5 letters for vowels, but there are what, like 20 vowels in
yeah,
English? So how are you going to represent 20 vowels with 5 vowels? I mean, the answer is clumsily, essentially. So, but I was wondering how Newar handles that also, because Newar also has some very large number of vowels, like English.
yes,
And, is it set up with actually 20? If it's a syllabary, then I presume these are 20 different. If it's a syllabary and it's in any way similar to Tibetan, which I, I know how to write, then, or like, I'm not fluent in Tibetan, but I know the writing system, then it would be using kind of diacritics, like above and below strokes, to say whether this is a ka or a ki or a ku or whatever. You'd have the same central element, but above and below there'd be different sort of waves and dashes and stuff to represent the vowels. But in Tibetan, the number of vowels is actually very small. So you have a single kind of flick, different kind of symbol for each vowel. Is that also the case with Newar if you've got something like 20 vowels to deal with?
yes. It's essentially the same basic principle as the Tibetan system, and they're both derived from an Indian system called Brahmi.
Mm,
And this was originally used for, in India, it was used for Sanskrit. And essentially the idea is you have individual aksharas or letters, you could say, for vowels. Each vowel has its own akshara, its own letter. But if you have a consonant beginning a syllable, then you have to write out that consonant first, and then you can modify that consonant by adding a different stroke. So you can
mm.
lengthen the to a by adding a line after the letter. And so essentially, I can explain the scripts. So I do have some examples here. The first, if you can see here, if people are watching the video, you can see on the top
Mm,
line is a script called Ranjana. And
mm,
Ranjana is a very ornate script that was originally only used for very, very expensive, very, very valuable manuscripts, and also things like signs, so the names of a temple, for example.
mm,
And then the second script underneath is called Prachalit, and Prachalit
mm.
means popular. It was the most common script that most people would write, and it's very, very close to and almost identical to Devanagari, which is the one that's used for Hindi.
So I've only ever seen the top one. Could you remind what's the name again of the top one?
The top one is called Ranjana Lipi.
Ranjana. I've only ever seen that one. So that is a kind of special script. This is also reminiscent of Tibetan in that Tibetan has 4 different,
Hmm.
essentially almost like fonts. It's like four
Yeah,
different ways of writing, and they're used a bit in different scenarios. So I've only seen that top one probably because I've mostly seen it in ornate settings like mm, calligraphic settings, really. So I imagine that's the one
yeah,
you choose for that kind of thing.
exactly. There are some longer manuscripts which are written entirely in Ranjana, but for the most part, it's used for things like titles. So these days on books, I don't think I have any other good examples. But these days on books, sometimes in Newar they will put the title in Ranjana Lipi, the
Mm,
script, but then the contents will all be in Devanagari. So when these scripts were first used in Nepal, they were all used only for Sanskrit. And it was only
mm.
in the 13th century that a early form of Prachalit Lipi, the second one, was started to be used for Newar. And because these are from Nepal and they were written by and for Newar people, and eventually they came to be used also to write the Newar language, they're referred to as kinds of Nepal lipi or Nepal script, the scripts of Nepal. But properly speaking, Nepal lipi usually only refers to the second one, Prachalit. And yeah, Prachalit is quite easy to learn. If you'd like to learn one of them, that's one that's quite easy to learn with a ball pen. Very similar to Devanagari.
I just thought of an analogy that, in a way, because they have presumably some similarity, the Prajalit and Vanjana.
Vanjana, yeah.
Is it a little bit like capital letters? Because the difference in European languages, usually you use capital letters and lowercase letters together in text. It's just certain things could be capitalized, like names or the start of a sentence. But if you actually, had you not learned them together, if you'd only learned when you learned to write, if you'd only learned uppercase letters, lowercase letters would be illegible to you. Like, you wouldn't know that a lowercase g and an uppercase g are this. Like, how would you know those are the same? They don't even look remotely similar. Whereas other ones are, even A, lowercase a, uppercase a. Other ones are a little bit easier to see, like K, uppercase K, lowercase k. They're kind of the same. But loads of other ones, or C or something, kind of the same. But loads of other ones are just like, how would you be able to tell one from the other? So it makes me think, like, imagine if in English you always wrote everything with lowercase, but if you want to be really fancy, you'd use all caps. It makes me think that's, I mean, it's not a situation that we actually have, but you could imagine it being a bit like that. And that's a bit like what these characters make me think of, that you have, like, in a way, two ways of writing different letters, but then they're used in different contexts.
Yeah, the principles behind them are the same, and they bear a resemblance. They're from the same origin, the same root. But yeah, if you only learn one, you might be able to read a little bit of the other, but you definitely wouldn't be able to write the other. So you'd have to learn them both from scratch. But if you know Devanagari, which many people who are learning a South Asian language might be familiar with, this is a script that's used for Hindi, for Nepali, and a number of other modern Indian and South Asian languages. Then learning Prachalit and learning Ranjana, I think, will always be hard, but learning Prachalit will be a bit easier if you know Devanagari first.
So does that mean that the Vanjana is specific to Newar, or rather, it became specific to Newar, although originally it was used for writing Sanskrit in the Kathmandu Valley? Is that right?
I would just say both Prachalit and Vanjana are unique to Newar culture. And so because the writing for Newar and for Sanskrit follow similar principles, although, as I mentioned earlier, the sounds of Newar don't perfectly map onto the Brahmi alphabet, the Brahmi scripts, like Devanagari, Prachalit, and Ranjana. But yeah, basically they can be used for either, and they still are used for either. If people are writing, let's say you're writing the title of it, copying out a Sanskrit text, you can write the title in Devanagari. You can write it in Devanagari, you can write it in Prachalit, you can write it in Ranjana. Yeah.
So, wow, okay, Devanagari as well. So, so in that case, this issue of Newar language endangerment is also an issue of a script endangerment, it sounds like, because if it's a unique script, then that's also another side to it.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, I don't know if you've heard about the Endangered Alphabets Project. I mentioned it before on this podcast. So the Endangered Alphabets Project, the sort of founder or leader of this movement is a chap called Tim Brooks, who I know. I visited him recently, actually. But yeah, I'm sort of partly involved in this as well. And it's just so that people know, it's essentially a movement around writing and thinking about the value of writing from a cultural perspective, in particular, looking at different scripts, like script diversity around the world, and lots of scripts that have a lot of historical and aesthetic significance. I mean, they're beautiful and culturally rich scripts, but often they are in decline or have largely not been used for some time. So this is an example of one where this is also a beautiful and very culturally specific script that I don't know if it's right to say it's on the decline, but certainly if it's used only with Newar, and Newar is now only something like 10% of people in Kathmandu can speak it, and only 50% of Newar people can speak it fluently, then that's, there seems to be relevant to talk about the script as also something that is potentially endangered, given that the language is endangered.
Yeah. So
but I don't know if you've ever thought about things from that angle. I mean, it's a little bit of a niche thing, this whole endangered writing movement, but I find it quite an interesting idea.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because of printing, which primarily used, until very recently, primarily used Devanagari, because the earliest printing presses were from India. They were taken from India, or bought from India, I should say, to Nepal, and used to write both Nepali and Newar. The traditional scripts were primarily only written by hand until very recently. So people didn't really have... There may have been a few presses which could have printed in Ranjana and Prachalat. But now, because of computer software, Unicode, both of them are encoded in Unicode. Actually, I think Ranjana might not be encoded in, but Prachalat is encoded in Unicode.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah. And now people can print it out on paper or display it on their screen. And also people can display it. They can view websites in Prachalat Lipi. And yeah, there are usually schools that are trying to teach the Newar language, like one of the ones that I attended. They usually teach scripts as well. They usually teach Ranjana and Prachalat as well. I think the Newar community views it just as equally as important as the language itself. This is a very important part of the culture and the heritage of the Kathmandu Valley. And
absolutely.
And so there is a lot of effort to preserve them.
So these books that you mentioned that were being written in the early 20th century, big flowering of literature, given that the printing was more in Devanagari, does that mean that this writing was generally written and read also in Devanagari rather than in these more kind of specific scripts?
That's right. Yeah. Most of the literature that was written in the 20th century Renaissance, early 20th century Renaissance of the Newar language, was written in or printed in Devanagari.
Devanagari. So I forget how to say it.
So, I mean, I can show you, I'm not sure if this will be visible on anyone's screen, but I can show you an example of a page. It's in Devanagari.
So I'm being shown some text here that looks just like if it were Hindi. As in, I obviously it's not Hindi, but to the untrained eye, you would think it might be Hindi. What I'm reading now, yeah.
And or Nepali, yeah, they use the same writing system, yeah. But yeah, it's in Newar.
Could I ask also about literacy? What are, I mean, on the one hand, I suppose there's literacy rates in general, but in specifically, what proportion of people who speak Newar would also be able to read these specific scripts?
Well, probably under 10%.
Under 10%?
Yeah. Yeah, they're really not commonly spoken. Commonly written or read.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean,
so that's 1% of people in the Kathmandu Valley now. Because if 10% can speak it, then 1% can read and write it.
Exactly.
But presumably they can normally read and write Devanagari.
Yeah, everyone in the Kathmandu Valley who's literate will be able to read and write Devanagari. If you have a look at the second line there, the Prachalat Lipi, and compare it to the Devanagari and the third line, you'll see that it bears quite close relation. It's quite similar.
It is quite similar. Yeah, it looks quite similar.
I think most people will be able to find their way around it. But in my experience, because I studied this in the Kathmandu Valley, and I got in the habit of writing it instead of Devanagari, and I noticed that most people had trouble reading it because it's just not used these days. but I think it's very beautiful.
Yeah. So a different topic I'd like to ask about is you learned this language as an adult, and you spoke about having a teacher. Do you know about the available learning resources or what a person would need to do if they wanted to learn to speak Newar?
For speaking Newar these days, there's really not a lot. There is a book by Hale. I believe the author is Austin Hale. That's a
Mm,
but that's a linguistic, more of a linguistic description of
mm,
the language. So in terms of textbooks, there's also not many. There are short ones like this one, which is often obtainable in bookstores that sell, Newar books in the Kathmandu Valley. Jojo Lapa, that means hello,
mhm,
or it means namaste in Newar.
mm,
Namaste
mm,
is it means it's a greeting. It just means hello, but it means a homage
mm,
to you. But
mhm,
yeah, this is quite a decent one. But it's essentially a phrase book. So if you really want to learn the language these days, you have to go to a school. So in terms of
mm.
online resources, there's not a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's to be honest, it's not something that's on the in the near term for Panglot, but I this as with many other languages, it would be a dream if we could get round to making some learning resources for Newar. That might take some time because we've got a lot of other things in front of us first. But I would absolutely love for Panglot to make some, uh, probably starting from an app, but then also possibly some other resources for
Yeah,
Newar. That would be an
that'd be
amazing
great.
thing. But
Yeah,
watch this space 'cause it's not going to happen in the next 12 months for sure. So in case anyone's holding their breath.
yeah,
But yeah, it's the kind of thing that I
I
would
see.
always, that I'm here to try and do. So hopefully in future we'll be able to get around to doing something like that. Um, would you I'm thinking about wrapping up now. I was thinking that maybe something you could share is a little bit more about the research that you're doing recently and some of your more recent research interests, just for other people to hear what you're getting on with nowadays.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, most of my research with regard to Nepal and Buddhism has been related to rituals, both texts and rituals. So last year I worked on, I mentioned this text by Nishtananda Vajracharya. He wrote this translation of the Lalita Vistara. Since the publication that I published last year, this translation of the same author of another text is it's in a digitally published journal. I can't hold up the copy. In terms of what that contained, it was essentially a set of Sanskrit verses, and this also I think characterizes a lot of the literature that you find in Nepal. So it's a set of Sanskrit verses that are popularly recited in rituals in Nepal, together with what is what has been characterized as an as a translation, but what is actually a kind of elaboration and explanation, which I think actually describes what translation really is. Is that translation is not a converting word for word or meaning for meaning, but it's really interpretation.
Mm.
I'm not sure if you've ever gotten into translation theory, but it's
I,
something
I've never had to translate anything very long. So, I feel like I would have a bit more of a man on the street understanding of it compared to other linguistic topics. But I mean, I do have the sense that in some way, translation is damage limitation. That, every time you translate, with some exceptions, but especially if you're doing something long and literary, then you're never going to be able to quite get it right because there are too many culturally specific words and meanings to put across. There might be puns and things which is going to be really hard to get, or rhyming, which is you're just going to have so much trouble with. So you got to prioritize and try and figure out how much of this can you put across. But ultimately, you will have some loss in terms of you really have to go to the original to get the full story. And so I've heard it described as damage limitation before.
Yeah, there are lots of terms like that that describe some of the difficulties people find when they're trying to figure out how much of any given text corresponds to the original. So you might have heard this line by, I think it was Robert Frost. Uh, um, what is it? Poetry is what is lost in translation. Maybe I got that wrong.
I haven't heard of that one actually before.
But there are some others, like in Italian, I might mispronounce this, traditore, translator, traitor.
Translator traitor, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is assuming translation is this is kind of to assume that translation is to reproduce or to instrumentally transmute one essence into a directly equivalent other essence in another language. But anyway, the point that I wanted to make was what Nishyananda did was very much not attempting to translate in the sense that a lot of people these days think of translation, but rather provide an explanation of the Sanskrit. So rather than providing 2 verses in Newar for two lines in Newar for 2 lines of Sanskrit, he provides a whole paragraph explanation. So it's a bit like a commentary, but it's presented as a translation. And then what I'm working on now, I'm working on quite a lot of things, but in relation to Nepal is actually looking at some of the Sanskrit literature that underpins rituals in Nepal. So looking at ritual manuals for essentially tantric ritual and how which forms the foundation of daily practice in a Newar Buddhist monastery. So yeah, essentially engaging in translation and study of this kind of literature.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Alexander. Thank you very much for appearing on the podcast today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Polyglot World Languages podcast. My company, Polyglot Languages, makes learning resources, including language learning apps, for lower resourced languages. Our mission is to make high-quality learning resources for as many languages as we can, treating each language and culture with the respect it deserves. We use a combination of linguistics, the science of learning, and our own decades of experience learning and teaching languages to produce highly effective apps and other products to teach exactly the kinds of languages you hear about on this podcast. You can find out more about our work by visiting our website at www.polyglotlanguages.com. I hope you have a great day.